Thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk about the power of logs and the future of observability. I'm Bill Peterson, Senior Director of Product Marketing with Sumo Logic. I'm joined today by Rachel Stevens, Senior Industry Analyst at RedMonk. Hi, Rachel.
Hello, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for coming. If you're not familiar with RedMonk, it's a developer-focused analyst firm. Go check them out at redmonk.com, please. Today, we're going to talk about three things that we're going to kind of frame a conversation here, almost a fireside chat. We're going to talk about observability, the definitions, and the importance of observability today in 2024. Then we're going to kind of take a step back and look at the historic pros and cons of logs for observability for practitioners and developers, kind of a historical view. And then you can guess where this is going. We're going to look at 2025 and beyond for logs and observability. So that's going to be the conversation. And I think what we'll do is jump right in. And Rachel, I'll ask you kind of your view on definition and importance of observability today in 2024.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. As Bill said, I'm Rachel Stevens from RedMonk. We focus on technology adoption trends from the developer and practitioner standpoint in particular. And I'm really excited to dive into observability, but I think before you can talk about the complexity and the definition of observability, you have to first understand the complexity of the app landscape. So observability as a term kind of came into being in 2016. And if you think about where we were at that point in technology, we have growing proliferation of services and microservice architectures. Our tool change were beginning to be much more fragmented than they had been and have become even more so in the last 8 years. It's become a lot of different things that every team has to manage to understand what's going on with their applications. We have increased uptime requirements, applications that are more business critical than ever. We're distributed worldwide in some cases, and our teams are being asked to work at a much faster pace in terms of just the velocity of delivering and development. It's just all come together in a way that applications are complex. And that means that observability as a term has also carried a lot of weight with it as we're trying to understand what it is that these applications are doing, because we're not in a place where we can hold it all in our head anymore. And so if you think about observability and kind of some of the key tenets of the definition, it would be things like I can understand my application just by looking at the outputs of my application, like it's introspectable. I can ask unknown questions of my application. I can see what my application is doing and I can explore it in real time. All of those are key tenets of observability as a concept. But it's also one of those concepts where the term has gotten really overloaded in the last almost decade as people have been using it. And so we have a whole lot of people who have applied a lot of different things to what it means to be observability. And then we have some segments of our industry who are starting to branch off. It's like, now is it time for observability 2.0? Is it time for a different term? What does this all actually mean? And I think we've gone through a lot of eras of what observability looks like to people. For some of them, we've kind of gone through like that 3 pillars of logs and metrics and traces as distinct telemetry that all make up observability. We have people who are talking about it's just about white events. We have people who are trying to figure out what all of these pieces of data mean and how it all comes together under this umbrella term of observability. So I think my question to you, Bill, is like, do you actually think it matters to have kind of this logs, metrics, traces framing for observability, or do you think that it's fine to start thinking about it in broader terms?
I think about it from the perception of what are we trying to do? And I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to simplify our observability, right? Let's simplify this whole, to your point, right? This massive data, whether it's logs, traces, metrics, events, all of it. And let's unify all of that information so we can get from at kind of the storage and not even beyond the storage, the analyzing of that data to some insights. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, is there an incident that we can resolve in the future so we can create a playbook or we can create some kind of automation? Or is this something where we can learn about what's going on in our data, what's going on in our systems? And then from a traces point of view, and I'd be interested for from your take on this is, are we building traces in at the development cycle, right? And are developers doing that? Are they actually even interested in that? Is that a good use of their time? Or can we fill that in later with some, if we start to talk about AI and ML capabilities, and we can kind of fill some of the traces in, and maybe any of those, if we think about it from a gap, any of those gaps in the traces, can we fill that in later and learn from that as well? So to your original question, yes, all the data, please.
Like it. So like when I think about traces,
Yeah.
if we had a super simple system where everything happened exactly in a row and we could actually we could follow one log to the next and we didn't have any parallelism or concurrency or distributed nature of things, then a log and a trace would really fall under the same umbrella of like we could figure out what's happening where, we could figure out all of these things. And what we have created in the tracing world is basically logs that are connected together in a way that help us understand connected stories. So it's like, how has one event impacted, and how are all of these events connected and rolling up into one another? So kind of nested traces within things, and nested versus like main traces. And so logs are really a basis of that trace world. But as you mentioned, it is implemented in a different way. A lot of people will call an unstructured log like digital exhaust, where it's something that is just created. Whereas you say like a trace, when you're having to actually go in there and write the spans into your code so people can have that defined way of how we are connecting things, it does require a different level of overhead on the development front. And so I think a lot of it is trying to figure out, one, are we now in a place where our tooling can help us make more value out of our unstructured data? And that is the entire premise of what we're talking about in this AI ML landscape. So what are we doing with our unstructured data? But I think the other thing is then trying to figure out where is my like balancing out, like, do I need to be making this effort on the front end of the development part, or is this something where we can get it with tooling on the back end to try to make it easier to understand things? And that's just what people have to weigh out.
Right, right. And what it really comes down to is, what are the actual end users or the companies using this data for, right? Is it incident management? Is it mean time to resolve? Is it to look for malicious activity, right? We can bring the security kind of side of the world into it. Is it to kind of get to that automated remediation so that we can have humans do more kind of constructive and better work than just worrying about, okay, there's a patch that's got to be kind of pushed out that we figured out because something broke. Okay, great. Do we need a human in the middle there? Kind of curious on your thoughts on that.
I think what you point to is a really important part of the logging landscape in general, is that as we've gotten to a point where we can add more and more context into a given log, it becomes more useful to different parties for different things. So a lot of the different logging vendors will talk about both the security side and the application and infrastructure side as two different audiences who would like to use the same information in different ways. And so that's really great. It also means that your logs are going to get larger and larger in general, because you start to add and append more data because more people are interested in different things. And so part of that is, how are you controlling the volume of your logs? And then also, how are you making it so that different audiences find it usable? Because not every audience is going to sit there and want to regex through everything. And then I think the other thing is trying to figure out what it is that is kind of that valuable core data for everyone in the organization, and can we surface that in useful ways?
Yeah, and we kind of look at that as it's all core data, right? Because we can ingest everything for free, and then we have flex pricing to allow you to run analytics at different levels that you, the customer, or the customer, not you, Rachel, but you, the customer, can kind of set the parameters of how deep do you want to go, and run analysis on that. So that's why we kind of look at it as, I always say, why not all the logs? Why not? I mean, there's obviously reasons, compliance and regulatory, storage, security, again, we'll bring that back up. But the net, I think, is, and the way I look at it is, if you're going to use logs as the fundamental discussion of an incident. Let's just talk about an incident, right? So the
Yeah.
log is the fundamental starting and ending point of that incident. And it's the start because that's where you found out something broke. And the end is you've decided to do something about it, whether that's just fix it one time, whether that's make it a playbook or an automation, an automated event, and proliferate that out through your organization. The ability to find all that data and use all that data and be able to make it actually actionable, right? So we go from insights to action. I think from my perspective, and I know from our customers and the customers that I've spoken to, that's what they ultimately want. It's just, how do we get there in an easy way? And I think for us, we look at that as for Sumo Logic being cloud native and the ability to ingest everything if you want, and then run analytics at different levels on it. That to me that makes a lot of sense. I mean, obviously, I'm a Sumo person, right? It makes a lot of sense, but I guess from your perspective, like, do developers actually want that? Do they want to be, do they even want to be in that loop?
This is a good question. And I think this ties into that second point that you were talking at the top of the webinar about what are the historic strengths and weaknesses of logs. And I think for a lot of people, logs are kind of that first like print console experience where you figure out how to debug. And so people, as a developer in particular, are familiar with logs as a tool to try to understand what's happening in their system. But as logs start to get more verbose, as your system gets more complex, that signal to noise issue becomes a very large issue for most developers. And so you need to have some kind of way to figure out, like, how do I do it? So like when you say that the logs are the starting point of an incident, I think they're the starting point to understanding an incident. But if you're trying to dive into the incident itself, like if you're starting at like, I'm just going to start like scrolling through logs and hoping for the best, like that has burned a lot of people. It's like, I'm never going to find what I need. We have to have that tooling in place to help us. How are we filtering? How are we finding out like where to start filtering down? Where do we start investigating? And so I think you are absolutely right that logs play a really crucial part in providing context for users, and especially unbounded high cardinality context in places where we especially like time series based things. And so we need to absolutely have logs at our disposal, but we need to have the tooling and systems around them to make it so that they're usable for a lot of people, because a lot of them, like logs in their raw state for a lot of people, are just a lot of noise.
Yeah, fair. So let's bind it a little bit. If we talk about from a application reliability and infrastructure reliability, I guess I would flip those, right? And again, we've kind of moved into the historical pros and cons. So I'm curious your take from a historical point of view, pros and or cons for using observability and logs for infrastructure and application reliability.
So I think it's trying to figure out how we can get solid information at the right time at the right cost. So it's like, can I get the information I need? Can it come in the point of time that I need it? And is it going to cost me an arm and a leg to do that? And so that's what everyone's trying to balance out when they're thinking about their infrastructure cost.
Right.
And so I think one of the things that we've seen in the observability space is just skyrocketing costs overall. People are trying to figure out like what is my downsampling, right? Like, what do I need to keep versus what do I throw? Like, how am I needing to store this? How it's like, am I doing kind of hot, cold storage for any of this? There's a lot of considerations that a lot of people are trying to figure out in terms of trying to figure out what data is useful for what length of time. And it's really complicated for a lot of people to try to figure that out. So I would say that is a historic con of just trying to figure out, like, what am I doing with all this data? Like, I know there's value here, but like at what cost?
Right. And do you think companies that apply data tiering to their data ingest can manipulate those costs and make that work for them?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are trying to play around with what is my ingest versus my storage cost. I think a lot of vendors are starting to experiment more in that space. And we're seeing some interesting things in terms of like, let's store things in like Parquet files, and then it's a little bit, it's a different storage mechanism, but it makes it maybe more cost effective on that storage side. And so I think we're seeing some experimentation from the vendor space in terms of trying to figure out how this all comes together in different ways so that it's both useful for the customers and there's still a viable business model for the companies. So it's like,
Right.
I don't think any company is out there trying to be malicious. I guess I can't speak to the intentions of all the companies, but like I in my heart, I do not believe people are maliciously trying to gouge all of the people who are their customers. They're just trying to figure out how is it that this is a viable business model. And I think that those, especially in the AI landscape, when people are using their data differently, is going to be shifting.
Sure, sure. And if we think about, again, from a historical point of view, using lessons learned from logs and I guess the first iteration of observability, I do want to come back to the naming. Let's talk about that for a little bit. How do you think, or how in your experience, organizations have used logs and observability and log management and the data that they've learned from logs to improve application release cycles and kind of quality? And again, that's again trying to frame it in that infrastructure reliability, application reliability. How have they we've talked a little bit about kind of the management and the tiering and ingest. How have they actually used it? What's the use cases?
So like if I'm thinking about like the three main tools, telemetry tools that we have at our disposal, the metrics would be like what happened, like real high level, like oh, like we had a memory, like all these different things. Spans and traces would be, let's try to pinpoint when, and then the logs would try to tell you the why. And so that's kind of that actionable, like let me figure out how all of this has gone down. Like root cause is, I think, a loaded term for a lot of people in the industry, but can I try to figure out what it is that was behind this action, and then can I take action to prevent this in the future? And so the context that comes out of a log is usually the core part of how we can actually start fixing our systems.
Right. So I kind of teased it a little bit. Let's go back to kind of naming, I guess. I always say that naming and pricing are the hardest parts of the gig, and I think that's pretty true.
Yep.
So observability 2.0, dynamic observability, just the next phase of observability. Like what are your thoughts there, and does it even matter to a practitioner? Do they even care?
I think, well, I'll take the second one first. I don't think most practitioners are going to care. I think in terms of like observability 2.0 versus just observability, if you're deep in the space, you probably have opinions. If you are a user, like you just want to be able to have the relevant data that you need when you need it.
Sure.
And so part of it is definitely how are we marketing and talking about things from the vendor space. That said, I do think that there's something really interesting happening in that observability 2.0 definition in and around wide events that I think is really useful. And so, do you have thoughts on any of that kind of stuff? I would like to hear how you're thinking about it.
Sure. So, I think again, if we're looking at all the data, and I say when I say all the data, it's kind of a little tongue in cheek, right? I think it's all the manageable data or all the manageable data you can afford to look at. But I like to believe that there's the ability to look at that data and analyze that data, and that Sumo Logic, for example, can help you to do that, to run your business better, save money, etc. So I think, in the guise of a wide event where you're looking at kind of everything, right? Start to finish. I guess that's kind of an interesting question I'll come back to you on in a second is, what does a wide event look like today, and what did a wide event look like in 2016 when we just started looking at that? But I think, if we can look at all of the data, and we can do some deep searches and queries on it. We can use AI and ML insights on it to kind of understand what's going on. We can do anomaly and threat detection on it. We can have default dashboards and run schema on demand against any of the wide event data to understand what happened. And I guess I'm thinking about it from an incident point of view. You might be thinking about it from something else, but I'm thinking about it from an incident point of view. Again, I come back to the if you have an application that can handle that data and provide results to you and allow you, and we haven't talked about metrics either, but allow you to identify the metrics that you as a company need to report on, why wouldn't you look at that? You know, why wouldn't you? I guess what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think so. When I think about wide events, it's can I add as much context as possible to the log? A lot of the times it feels like it comes up structured rather than unstructured. So trying to figure that out. So I know that Sumo Logic definitely plays a lot in the unstructured world and helping people manage that. So we can come back to that. But I think for me, a lot of the wide event things is like how much context can I provide in a single log line? And when you're talking about metrics, like there's definitely people that we have seen who are adding not necessarily mathematically sound metrics, but it's like, can I pull some of this information about my runtime from my span, append it into my log, and then when I'm debugging, it's not going to be a true metric, but can it help me then just with that quick debugging and trying to isolate what's going on without having to switch systems or being able to have higher cardinality metrics than I could get if I was doing everything in a metric system that doesn't allow time series based things. And so I think all of those things together are coming into a place where logs really are kind of that underpinning core part of how I think of a wide event.
Okay. I think we just got the name right there. It's wide observability. That's what it is.
Oh, I like it.
I'm kidding, folks. I'm kidding. Let's move into our last section where we can just talk about going forward. Like how, I think we probably both agree at different levels that logs play a very important part in what we're doing moving forward. Myself and Sumo have an opinion on this, and we have an approach that we feel is kind of unique. But let's look at it from a, again, developer practitioner point of view. You know, if we're in 2025 through, I don't know, 2030, let's say, you know, where is this market going? What are the drivers for it? And what are practitioners and developers going to care about? Like what are they actually going to care about for in this market?
Yeah, so I think in this space, we have seen increasing automation in the last decade, really, of trying to, can I correlate events? Can I suppress noise? Can I make it so that it's easier for people to pinpoint what's going on? Like we've been working on statistical and machine learning methods to elevate all of those systems or elements of our system so that we can make it easier for people to understand. And that's been going on for a long time. That's going to continue. And then I think we also are now we're in an era where it is inevitable that AI ML will continue to play a larger role, whether you love it or hate it. It's going to be part of the landscape. And so I think for this system in particular is, can we query our systems? Can we have it so that you kind of talked about run books and things being kind of that last step. I think AI ML is going to start to play some kind of role there. Like, can I, rather than have an explicit run book that is all written out, can I chat through what it is I'm supposed to do? Like, chat will play an interesting role in at least some of these things. And then I think we're also just going to see a lot more data that is coming through and a lot more unstructured data. And so we're going to have to figure out ways that we're going to deal with that.
Right. Right. Well, as you know, we're big fans of unstructured data, so it bring more of it in. I guess as I think about the future of this, you know, I kind of always have this kind of low, medium, and high definitions. I guess I'll say, you know, what kind of analytics or what kind of AI do you want to run against this data, and is it, because you get into, you know, especially if we think about, let's say we're gonna do some Gen AI tooling against logs, and I'm saying all the logs. Okay, great, but that's compute. that's storage, that's network, that's bandwidth, right? So, I guess what are your thoughts on, as we kind of mature in this market and we start, to your point, where it's inevitable, will there be tiers of how much we're doing against log data from a Gen AI point of view? Like, is that the future? I can't imagine a um, wide open LLM for all log
Yes.
data all the time, right? That really won't happen.
That would be like when we're talking about how people struggle historically with cost levers in this data. You add in an LLM, that's going to get pricey real fast. So like it's definitely, there's going to need to be tiered strategies and approaches in terms of how we're thinking about that. And I think you're also just, I think one of the historic things that people struggle with, or just make sure that you have to be careful with list logs, is that you're not exposing private or sensitive information accidentally. And so that is another one where it's like potentially really sensitive information plus LLMs is always a kind of, you got to be careful. So you have to make sure that you know what you're doing. And so I think that's a place where we will need vendor iteration and vendor support. And I think it's also going to be a place where people, again, are going to have to really weigh out cost levers, because I think that's going to be the next place where we're going to have to start thinking about what it is that we specifically are going to be deriving value from.
Right. I wonder if at some level we kind of, it almost, like we talked about kind of historical, I wonder if we kind of come back to monitoring and observability, and monitoring is kind of your lower level, and I'm talking about with Gen AI, right? And then observability, whatever that definition ends up becoming, is where you actually run some Gen AI against it. And to your point, maybe it's chat, customer service is probably going to be the first place, right? We see this, right? Because how many incidents do we hear about from our customers first, right? We don't even know it's happening. And I'm talking, retail, healthcare, travel, entertainment, any of those big kind of companies where they don't realize something is broken until their customers are telling them. So that kind of line of monitoring and observability maybe comes back around, and maybe the definitions fall back into those categories. That could be interesting. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I don't know if I want to make predictions on how the industry is going to choose to define things. Usually that is a losing game, I have discovered. But I do think that you're right, that like all of those components are going to be things that we need our systems going forward. And whether they are separate or together, or how we are defining all of those things, I don't know if I have a specific opinion on, but I agree that all of those elements are going to need to be there.
Cool. Awesome. I think we're just about the end. I'm going to look in. We don't have any open questions in the Q&A. If anybody's listening and has a question, you get to be first, so pop it in. I'll ask another question of you, Rachel, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
We touched really briefly on metrics, and I guess KPIs and metrics and results. I kind of want to get to results on using logs and using observability. Like, when I say metrics for that to you, what's the top 3 mental list that pops up for you?
In terms of what system metrics do I need to care about?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think it's a lot of the infrastructure stuff is going to be like the golden metrics of like where's my CPU and my memory, kind of just like the general state of the system, latency, things like that. And then from there, it's, can you dig down and start to filter? So I think sometimes it's really nice if you can have like that metric based graph of like if something has fallen off a cliff or something has super spiked. And then if you can augment that with some of the information around, okay, like was it based off of a specific geography, or was it a specific like so it's like it's that exploratory nature of what you can get from white events or logs on top of metrics, where you start to have interesting things.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I always think about, obviously for me as a product marketer, I kind of sometimes start at the end and then work back. So starting at the metrics, like what is somebody going to really report about this? And then kind of work back is one way that, we kind of think about it over time. I think we're at the time. I want to thank you, Rachel, very much for joining us. This was a lot of fun, and I wish we had another hour to talk, but you know,
Well,
we
great.
for folks that have joined us, please, you can do a demo at sumologic.com or do our free trial. And also, again, please take a look at Rachel's research on redmonk.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you.